ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're calling in from today. My name is Maya Nowens. I am the Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization at the IISS in London, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you today to today's event on US-China competition in artificial intelligence. Now, today's webinar addresses the competition between the US and China on AI and investigates two different perspectives on whether AI will help stabilize great power strategic competition or whether it will do the opposite, which is to destabilize and create greater uncertainties in the relationship. In order to discuss these two views, I am delighted to welcome our two excellent speakers, Dr. James Johnson and Dr. Greg Austin. Dr. Johnson is a lecturer at Aberdeen University and holds various positions at academic institutions and think tanks in the US and UK, including the University of Leicester, Towards a Third Nuclear Age Project, and the CSAS Project on Nuclear Issues. Dr. Johnson studies the intersection of nuclear weapons, deterrence, strategic stability, great power competition, and emerging technology. And in his presentation today, Dr. Johnson will discuss the findings from his latest book, The Future of Warfare, USA, China, and Strategic Stability. Dr. Greg Austin leads the IISS Cyberspace and Future Conflict Program based in Singapore. Although today he's luckily dialing in from Berlin, so saving himself a very late night if he had been in the Singapore office. Dr. Austin previously worked at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, where he set up Australia's first master's degree in cyber war and peace, and he has held senior positions in the East-West Institute and the International Crisis Group. Dr. Austin's work focuses on national cyber policies, cyber civil defense, and technology competition with a special reference to China, Russia, and the US. Dr. Austin will review the findings of the US National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence in his presentation. Now, before I hand the floor to James and Greg, I'd like to make some housekeeping notes. The presentation section of this webinar will be on the record. However, the Q&A session following the presentations will be strictly off the record. The IISS is recording the presentation section of this evening, and we will make a copy of it available on our website, but the Q&A session will not be included in that recording. If you would like to ask a question, you have two options that I will repeat to you later before we start our Q&A. But just for a heads up, you can type your question in the Q&A box. If you do, please remember to indicate your name and affiliation. If you would also, you can also opt to ask a question live. Please use the raise hand function to indicate you would like to do so. And when I call on you, our IT team will unmute your microphone so that you can speak. Please again, state your name and affiliation when you do so. We will hear the presentations for about 45 minutes in total, following a roughly 45 minutes Q&A, ending strictly at 3:30 p.m. UK time at the end of our webinar. And with no further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Johnson to kick us off with his presentation. Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maya. Let me just try and share my screen here with you guys. Here we go. Okay, I mean, that seems to be coming through my end. So without further ado, let me kick off just by briefly extending my thanks to Greg for his generous introduction and inviting me to talk to you today at IISS, and obviously to Maya for acting or agreeing to act as discussant, and a big thanks to Seetha as well and the IIS team working behind the scenes here to facilitate the event today. And apologies in advance for any unashamed self-promotion of my new book or excessive use of military jargon during this presentation. I'll do my utmost to kind of reduce or minimize those two areas. Okay, so in this presentation today, I'll begin with a brief AI primer to ground the discussion in what we mean by AI in a military context. Then I will outline some of my core arguments and themes that run through my book and related subsequent projects. This section includes some fictional scenarios or counterfactual thinking to consider some possible real-world consequences of my findings. I'll close out with a brief discussion on some takeaways and some policy implications of my research, leaving some time for comments and Q&A. So artificial intelligence research began as early as the 1950s. However, we saw an explosion of interest in the field around a decade ago. And this was due to the convergence of four key developments: the exponential growth of computer processing power, expanded data sets, advances in the implementation of machine learning techniques and algorithms, especially deep learning reinforcement networks, and perhaps most importantly, the rapid expansion of commercial interest and investment in AI. Because of the diverse approaches to AI-based research, there is no universally accepted definition of artificial intelligence, which has caused some confusion when the term is used often to make generic claims about its grandiose use and applications and its revolutionary effects. In fact, any new task that AI is capable of doing is often judged to be, by definition, revolutionary. AI itself is a subfield of computer science focused on computation, problems through search, heuristics, logic, reasoning, and probability. It also draws heavily from mathematics, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, and especially neuroscience. In a military context, AI is better thought of as a potential enabler or force multiplier of an existing range of existing weapon systems. That is to say, AI is more akin to electricity, radar, and radio than a standalone weapon per se. These two Venn diagrams illustrate some of the connections between several often misused terms and disciplines and concepts that relate to AI and associated with the broader fourth industrial revolution. Now, especially relevant for this presentation are machine learning, algorithms, and autonomy. I promise there's only two more diagrams to go. This flowchart depicts the so-called evolving AI ecosystem and the evolving various portfolio of capabilities that AI technology can enable, such as image, speech, text recognition, information gathering and dissemination, predictive analysis, and machine vision. So in terms of my main core arguments or thesis for my book, these relate to four interrelated arguments. First of all, in isolation, AI has few discernible or direct effects on nuclear or strategic stability. That is, as a standalone capability, AI will unlikely be a game changer or silver bullet. Instead, much like cyberspace, it will more likely mutually reinforce the destabilizing effects of existing advanced weapon systems. In short, AI does not exist in a vacuum. That is to say, AI can be better understood as a manifestation or an accelerator of an established trend in emerging technologies associated with increasing speed of warfare, shortening the decision-making timeframe, and the commingling or blurring of nuclear and non-nuclear or conventional weapon systems. Secondly, AI's impact on stability, deterrence, and escalation will likely be determined as much, if not arguably more so, on states' perceptions of its functionality, both tactically and operationally, than what it's actually capable of doing. For an example, even if an autonomous drone swarm was not intended to be or even able to execute a disarming first strike, the perception alone of the feasibility of such an operation would likely elicit distrust between nuclear adversaries and be destabilizing nonetheless. A good case in point was the diplomatic standoff that followed China's seizure of a US undersea drone in 2016, This incident, while thankfully being de-escalated, demonstrated clearly the potential risk of inadvertent escalation caused by strategic ambiguity about the deployment of new technology in contested territory between adversaries. The third argument relates to the simultaneous pursuit of AI by great military powers, especially China, the United States, and Russia. And this will likely amplify some of the destabilizing effects of AI in a military context. In the second, or arguably third, nuclear age, consisting of 9 nuclear powers with varying degrees of interest, capabilities, and perceptions of their place in the world order, AI will likely compound the impact immersion technology is already having during peacetime, and likely have during a crisis or conflict between nuclear armed rivals. In this way, nuclear multipolarity is important precisely because different states will choose very different options to address the new choices that are emerging in the digital age. The final argument, and related, relates to this inopportune geopolitical background which we find ourselves, and this perceived strategic benefits of AI-powered weapons that will likely prove irresistible to certain states in order to asymmetrically capture or sustain the technological upper hand and first mover advantages vis-a-vis adversaries. Echoing these sentiments, and obviously apropos for this presentation, the US National Security Commission on AI, in its final report published this year, stated that without the adoption of AI, the US would almost certainly lose the ability to defend the US and its allies. The core research themes of my book, which I'll unpack briefly in this presentation, relate to how and why AI-fused capabilities might cause or exacerbate escalation risk, complicate deterrence, and impacts crisis stability dynamics in future conflicts between nuclear armed states. These include the commingling of military technology and escalation risk, hyperspeed or gigahertz military warfare, and compressing decision-making, the AI stability versus instability debate, the risk of accidental nuclear war, and the dilemma of automating decisions to machines. Connecting these themes are 3 factors or features of the digital age that I argue will complicate nuclear stability, including information overload and complexity, disinformation and misinformation, and greater automation of NC3 or nuclear command and control systems. So the first theme deals with the commingling or entanglement of military technology. Today, there are multifaceted possible intersections of AI with a range of state-of-the-art, non-nuclear strategic weapons that could compromise states' nuclear assets in conventional counterforce operations, including things like cyber weapons, precision munitions, and anti-satellite and hypersonic weapons. The increasingly complex interactions between or within tightly enmeshed systems that control both nuclear and conventional weapon systems have, I argue, become a critical risk in the digital age. Now, this commingling set is further aggravated by 2 recent developments. Firstly, the blurred boundaries between advanced conventional and nuclear weapon systems. And second, an increasingly political willingness, especially by the United States, Russia, and arguably China, to use nuclear weapons to respond to conventional attacks that target an adversary's nuclear assets, such as their early warning systems, command and control facilities, and even their nuclear launch sites. AI-enabled capabilities could complicate nuclear deterrence in several ways, including making it easier to find nuclear weapons, attacking nuclear support systems, with cyber weapons, for example, and deploying drones, especially micro drones, in swarms, in surveillance, recon, and preemptive strike missions against nuclear assets. Now, the impact of these kind of operations will be more severe in an asymmetric skirmish between nuclear armed rivals. For example, in an anti-access or aerial denial attack, where use them or lose them or preemptive pressures may exist. In short, the increasingly capable advanced technology like AI, introducing these technologies into the nuclear enterprise is already challenging long-held assumptions about deterrence, escalation, crisis stability, and arms control. Consider this following scenario. State A attacks State B's early warning systems located in B's non-nuclear missile launch sites as a purely tactical maneuver. Now, because these systems are used by B to warn them of an imminent nuclear attack, i.e. their dual use in nature, B concludes the attacks are a prelude to a disabling first strike. Thus, an attack A intended to remain under the nuclear threshold, B views as deliberate escalation. That is to say, B assumes A must know that an attack on its dual systems will be highly provocative. Because A does not consider its behavior as offensive, it views B's response as highly provocative and escalatory, thereby triggering inadvertent escalation. China, for example, is believed to commingle its nuclear and conventional early warning systems, situational awareness, and surveillance technology, which some experts, including myself, believe increases the risk of these kinds of inadvertent risk. This is the final chart, I promise. This chart depicts AI applications that are either being tested, deployed, or in many cases, subsequent to my book being published, already deployed within the nuclear deterrence architecture, including early warning systems, intelligence, surveillance, and recon systems, command and control systems, precision strike and delivery, technology, and other non-dual and non-nuclear deterrence operations, such as cyber warfare, again, missile defense, and counter-space systems. Okay, so the second theme I'd like to unpack is the hyperspeed warfare, or as the cool kids are calling it, gigahertz speed, and compressing the decision-making timeframe. AI introduces a unique means to operate or respond at machine speed in the use of military force. In military arenas, since time immemorial, where a premium is placed on autonomy and speed, faster reaction times, for example, gathering and analyzing intel for cueing long-range precision missiles, will likely have an outsized strategic effect. Now, a key point to emphasize here is that massive increases in the speed of combat could result in machines reacting to situations at a pace that surpasses human comprehension. So much so that commanders may be unable to control, contain, or even terminate events. And this exact point was quoted from my book and again cited in the US Commission on AI. Imagine, for example, if the Cuban Missile Crisis was truncated from 13 days to a matter of hours, minutes, or even nanoseconds. I argue, therefore, that until experts, especially AI research experts, unravel some of the more unexplainable, unpredictable, or so-called black box features of AI, human error and machine error will likely compound one another with uncertain and unexpected outcomes. For the good news, and that for now at least, it remains self-evident that humans' decisions escalate or de-escalate a situation, especially in the nuclear domain. However, technology like AI that enables weapons to operate at high speeds, ranges, and lethality could potentially move a situation more quickly and arguably inadvertently up the various escalation rungs to a nuclear level of conflict. So is AI a double-edged sword for stability? On the one hand, AI augmented command and control tools, for example, pattern recognition technology, may overcome several shortcomings inherent in human decision-making during wartime conditions, such as the tendency to invest in sunk costs, skewed risk judgments, heuristics, and groupthink, with potentially stabilizing effects. Besides, faster and more reliable AI applications can enable commanders on the ground to make more informed decisions during a crisis. Additional benefits might include things like improving the safety and reliability of nuclear support systems, strengthening cyber defensives, enhancing battlefield awareness, creating new and innovative solutions for arms control and possibly nuclear stockpiles, and potentially reducing false positives or nuclear close calls and the risk of human error caused by things like fatigue, repetition, and cognitive bias. On the other hand, and this is where my book's arguments generally lies, is that the introduction of these multiple data streams could equally and more likely overwhelm the ability of human decision makers to determine the credibility of data, particularly when the provenance and validity of this data cannot be easily verified or has been manipulated. Moreover, information overload and complexity could create new vulnerabilities and potentially sources of error, which motivated state or non-state actors especially could potentially exploit. This particular problem set is compounded further by the shortened response times available to decision makers, and particularly where launch or warning or these hair trigger nuclear postures are present. In short, absent human judgment and control, together with the inherent brittleness or lack of context or common sense of existing machine learning algorithms, the risk of destabilizing accidents and false alarms is set to rise. So how might AI tools in the hands of third-party actors drag nuclear adversaries into a conflict? In the digital era, the catalyzing chain of reaction and reaction dynamics set in motion by a third-party actor, thinking here of criminals, for example, or terrorists or proxy actors, could potentially bring two or more nuclear armed rivals close to the brink. And I argue this is fast becoming a plausible scenario. The historical record going back to the Cold War is replete with examples of nuclear false alarms, accidents, luck, and other risks associated with increasingly complex, porous, interconnected, and automated nuclear control systems. And this far predated the introduction of AI. And these so-called or alleged closed systems offers motivated actors, of which there's no shortage of, multiple pathways to manipulate and exploit these systems. In the digital age, decision makers must grapple with greater volumes of information, for example, coming from satellite imagery, 3D models, and increasingly open source geospatial data, which during a crisis can create novel pathways to manipulate and propagate campaigns of mis and disinformation. In theory, a non-state actor could target nuclear command and control systems, early warning satellites and radars with AI-enhanced cyber weapons, without the need for any kinetic or physical attack, let alone the possession of nuclear weapons, to have Tom Schelling's so-called power to hurt. Now, while such an attack is likely beyond the abilities of the most sophisticated and opportunistic non-state actors, I argue that emerging technology like AI will likely lower this threshold increasingly and create new pathways to accomplish the nefarious goals of non-state actors, especially through the manipulation and distortion of the information landscape or ecosystem where decision making takes place. For example, things like spreading disinformation, conspiracy theories, false memes, and fake news on social media. During a crisis involving two nuclear powers, where communications are compromised, nuclear arsenals are on high alert, decision-making timeframes are compressed already, and especially where launch authority is pre-delegated, i.e. to nuclear-armed submarines, the consequences of these kinds of information operations could obviously be catastrophic. To give you a recent case in point is the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis. This crisis combined a toxic mixture of cross-border terrorist attacks, disputed territory, offensive nuclear postures on both sides, and escalatory rhetoric playing out on social media, including implicit nuclear threats. Therefore, it is very easy to understand or imagine how the actions of a third-party actor might spark a nuclear accidental war. This dynamic is compounded by the human tendency to make fast, reflective, and shortcuts or heuristic judgments, or so-called system one thinking, when an abundance of information exists alongside unfamiliar technologies, which can mean manipulated and false information can be accepted as fact, even if it can be easily debunked. In sum, AI-powered technology is rapidly becoming another capability in the toolkit of third-party actors to wage campaigns of disinformation and deception, which both sides in the competitive dyad, see US and China, may have used against them. In this fictional scenario, we see AI machine learning generated deepfakes or GANs, and we see how these have added a new twist to the risk of miscalculation and misperception that originates in the virtual world, but that can have a very real impact in the physical one. For example, to incite conflict between two nuclear rivals during a crisis. Think of India and Pakistan. State A hires proxy hackers to launch a deepfake video depicting a senior military commander of State B, conspiring to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on C. This false or fake news is then deliberately leaked into C's intelligence gathering and analysis systems, putting C under intense domestic political pressure to escalate a situation with an unprovoked retaliatory strike. In response, B, fearful of a decapitating strike and losing its first mover advantages, responds in kind. Now, while social media platforms have had some, albeit limited, success in slowing down users' ability to orchestrate these kinds of disinformation, once an operation goes viral, for example, via bots or deepfakes, the ability to curtail them is extremely difficult, both for the human operator and the machine. During the 2019 India-Pakistan crisis, and despite Facebook's best efforts or countermeasures, fake news and doctored images reach more than 2.8 million WhatsApp users. Taken together, the increasingly sophisticated and accessible nature of disinformation, the dual-use nature of AI, the problem of attribution in cyberspace, the increasingly complex and interdependent nature of nuclear systems, together with compressed decision-making, will likely lower the threshold for so-called false flag operations such as fake nuclear alerts or potentially subverting real alerts with social media. So on to the final theme. How might delegating decisions to machines affect stability and deterrence? During crisis conditions, the deterrent effect of AI, much like other capabilities, is predicated on the perceived risks associated with a particular capability it enables or enhances. The higher the uncertainty generated by capacity, thus deploying AI augmented capabilities into a crisis might encourage an adversary to act more cautiously, thereby increasing the deterrent effect. Perhaps more counterintuitively, therefore, states may view further automation of nuclear systems as a possible way to manage escalation and even bolster deterrence. That is signaling to an adversary that an attack or even the threat of one might trigger a nuclear response. Put another way, there is a prima facie argument that exists that building automated response mechanisms into nuclear systems might resolve the logical paradox inherent with rational-based classical deterrence. That is premised on the concept of mad or mutually assured destruction and the will to retaliate, thus ensuring mutual vulnerability and improving stability. However, on the negative side of the ledger, because of the difficulty of demonstrating this kind of complex and nuanced posture before a crisis or conflict, or especially during one, we can see this kind of implicit threat as something like a Dr. Strangelove's doomsday machine on steroids. And this will equally or more likely worsen stability. In short, while AI enhanced capabilities can certainly offer militaries with major offensive and defensive operational tactical advantages, being unable to demonstrate or signal this capacity to others, especially in asymmetric military situations, will unlikely, I argue, promote stability and peace, and more likely have the opposite effect. Now, the critical factor here will likely come down to the degree to which a particular technology disproportionately affects states' perceptions of the balance of power. Besides the confusion and uncertainty that would inevitably result from mixing various and potentially unknown levels of human to machine interaction, and AIs reacting to events in non-human ways at machine speed, could dramatically increase inadvertent and accidental escalation risk. This risk could be further amplified by an overconfidence in and a reliance on AI decision-making tools, known in psychology parlance as automation bias. This could mean that false negatives and false positives could go unnoticed or even ignored. For example, the recent defeat of an F-16 fighter pilot by the AI in the Dartmouth-sponsored Alpha Dogfight Challenge clearly demonstrated how AIs performing in complex and dynamic, albeit virtual environments for now, can compress decision-making and use very unorthodox or non-human tactics in a high-stakes game of human-to-machine chicken. So how might mixing various human-to-machine levels of interaction affect this deterrent paradigm? Recent experimental wargaming hosted by Rancor in the US explored the effects of mixing various degrees of human and machine collaboration on crisis dynamics. And these games revealed some very interesting, albeit preliminary findings. The games found that all things being equal, when higher levels of autonomy is combined with human decision-making, or so-called humans in the loop, escalation risk is generally lower. This hypothesis was attributed to the fact that human involvement in decisions will likely allow for more time to de-escalate a situation. And humans are generally thought to be, at least for now, better at understanding signaling compared to an AI. In a separate and perhaps more futuristic configuration, when higher levels of automation is combined with decisions made by machines or humans out of the loop, not surprisingly, escalation risk is perceived to be, by humans that is, higher. Conceptually speaking, an AI optimized to pursue particular pre-programmed goals could very easily misinterpret an adversary signaling a desire for resolution or de-escalation, thus complicating the very delicate balance that exists between an actor's willingness to escalate a situation or use nuclear weapons as an absolute last resort and keeping the option open to step back from the brink. For example, would commanders become too reliant on an AI in a military situation, believing it to be superior or better at doing its job? Or juxtaposed, might commanders equally consider or distrust AI's recommendations because of its black box or machine fuzzy logic? And might an adversary calculate risks very differently due to the presence of non-human agents on the opposing side? In short, while delegating decisions to machines during a crisis might lower the risk to human life and potentially reduce accidents and miscalculation, the absence of a normative deterrence framework or escalation framework, especially things like fire breaks, signaling, or de-escalation off-ramps, which don't exist in an AI context, and for now, even in a cyber context, will likely further compress or even entirely remove various rungs from Herman Kahn's metaphorical escalation ladder, with uncertain and destabilizing outcomes. So from what I've discussed so far, there are obviously several and a multitude of trade-offs that result from the employment of AI and autonomy in the nuclear enterprise and the military domain more broadly, that should persuade policymakers and military commanders to pause to consider how and whether AI-powered technologies might strengthen or complicate stability and deterrence in a very fragile, multipolar nuclear world order. Examples of some of these trade-offs include things like ensuring adequate control and supervision of AIs to mitigate escalation risk, while also exploiting the benefits of increased lethality, speed, and scale offered by AI technology. Assimilating AI into force structure and doctrine, while mitigating the dangers posed by machine speed and reduced levels of control and oversight of nuclear weapons. And designing algorithms to support nuclear systems with sufficient knowledge of the laws of engagement and human laws of warfare and other legal and normative warfaring frameworks without degrading the capacity to respond and predict threats. Put simply, today governments face significant contradictions, dilemmas, and trade-offs about whether and how to integrate AI and autonomy into the nuclear and military domain, which must be examined in the context of a broader quest for effective deterrence, stability, and non-proliferation goals. So to tackle the elephant in the room, having highlighted all of these potential risks, how can they be managed or mitigated? I'll outline some broad lines of efforts that could be considered, and we can go into more depth, hopefully, in the Q&A session. Now, I categorize these into four broad areas. First, enhancing the safety and reliability and hardening nuclear systems and processes. For example, adding safeguards and risk assessments to strengthen nuclear systems against cyber attacks. Second, improving command and control protocols and mechanisms. For example, adding redundancies and enhancing launch protocols and authentication codes. Thirdly, designing more robust safeguards to contain the consequences and errors when accidents inevitably occur. For example, enhancing personnel training and collective monitoring of events. And finally, modifying existing arms control and verification approaches, innovating new norms and behavior in the use of AI systems, as well as encouraging bilateral and multilateral confidence building measures between allies and adversaries, and broader stability dialogue on emerging technology. And this is an area highlighted and underscored by the recommendations of the US Commission on AI. For now, at least, because AI is not currently integrated into states' nuclear targeting, command and control and launch systems, at least I argue explicitly, a narrow window exists for nuclear powers to agree on new principles, practices, norms, and international legal frameworks. For instance, clarifying some of the lines of responsibility and accountability in the use of AI-enhanced systems if or when things go wrong. In closing, given the rapid pace of these developments, now is a time for positive intervention before it is too late. That is to preempt and mitigate the possible destabilizing effects of AI and help steer it towards enhancing stability as the technology evolves and matures. As Yogi Berra reminds us, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And we can discuss more of these specific measures during the Q&A session. I'll leave the conversation there, the presentation, and hand back to Moy and Greg. And thank you for your interest. Just to stress, a lot of this work is still work in progress. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback, comments, and questions.
Thank you very much, James, for that excellent and very in-depth presentation. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box. I'll remind our audience that you're welcome to add to those. And I'll now hand over to Greg Austin, dialing in from the Berlin office for his presentation. Greg, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Maya, and thank you, James, for an excellent presentation. I think you've laid out in a highly articulate and sophisticated fashion some of the challenges that are really daunting, arising from the use of AI in military systems. And one can only really think back to earlier periods in history where we can be glad that AI did not exist, because the gulf between the perceptions of key players, for example, in the 1960s and the 1970s, between the United States and the Soviet Union, the gulfs were severe. And as a senior CIA official put it in 1994, looking back on the history of understanding of the United States of Soviet leaders, the CIA concluded that they were so wrong in the Cold War. They thought that the Soviet Union had sophisticated ideas of escalation and nuclear war. But in the end, their conclusion was, based on intelligence that they discerned after the end of the Cold War, that the Soviet leaders really had confused and confusing ideas about nuclear war and were not systematic. So the question of how we apply your very excellent framework to the systems of thinking, in particular actors such as the United States, China, or Russia, India, Pakistan, for example, Israel, and other states, become really important. And that's one reason why I thought it would be useful to bring to people's attention, those who don't already sort of see it in the same way I do, this report of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that was mandated by the US Congress. I think it's a pretty profound document. It reveals all sorts of complexities about US thinking. It reveals all sorts of contradictions about how people in different parts of the community think about these issues, but it's interesting to reflect on it as a manifestation of the what you might call a consensus view or a collective view of artificial intelligence because of the way that the study was put together. I'll just share my screen. So just to help frame my view of the problem in the same way that James framed his view, and one thing that the National Security Commission on AI observed is that research and development in artificial intelligence is a globalized enterprise. So if we're trying to understand a bilateral competition between the United States and China in AI, how do we do this when it's actually a global enterprise? That's one point of framing. Attributing nationality to an AI research activity is quite difficult. We should also bear in mind that AI involves discrete fields, discrete subfields, can be applied in very many sectors of activity, subsectors, and so on. And in the way we understand the capabilities of country A or country B in each of those subsectors and subfields, and we try and aggregate it up to form a view of who's winning the AI race, I think that's a pretty challenging intellectual task. And one of the reasons I am attracted to this National Security Commission report on AI is that they don't try to do that, nor do they offer a way of doing it, yet they make all sorts of sweeping arguments about how the United States needs to win this competition, how the United States is currently winning the competition, and how it's so important to stop China from doing A, B, and C, without too much sort of fine detail on what this aggregation process is. We can say, for example, that the US leads in certain applications in certain subfields and China in others. And I think we should bear in mind as a framing argument the proposition from the OECD that every country has its own distinct priorities and enablers when it comes to exploiting AI for economic gain. Now I've lost my, there we go. So a bit of background quickly on the National Security Commission on AI, set up by Congress with this intention of understanding the ways in which artificial intelligence could comprehensively address the national security and defense needs of the United States. So it's very much focused on the national security needs of the United States, but the subtext of it is well captured in a turn of phrase in the document, which says that the United States must pursue the holy grail of artificial intelligence. So that's a sort of emotional and aspirational intent that the United States, this commission gave itself. And it's really important, I think, to take note of this report of the commission. I won't go into the background too much about who was on it and the like, but this report, really reflecting some of the best opinions and assessments of a whole range of people in the United States, assesses that the United States is ahead of all other countries now in the research and development and exploitation of artificial intelligence. That's a really big judgment because there's quite a few people in the United States who say that that's not true, that China's racing ahead and is already ahead in some areas. Even in this report, there was some background work done which basically said that out of 6 fields, 6 types of activity in the AI area, the United States was clearly ahead in 3 and China may be ahead in another 3. That's not in the main report, but I'll get to that a little bit later. The commission is very interesting and it's really, the report is highly valuable, but I think we must observe some of the background elements to it and some of the aspects of it. I think that any major foreign policy and security initiative that came out of the Trump administration has to be examined to see how Trumpian it is and how rational it is. And this report has clear Trumpian elements in it. Overall, it's an excellent report, but you can't escape the Make America Great Again element of it. So I'm not saying believe everything that's in it, but I think there's some really important, powerful messages in it that we should take away. One example of the ambitiousness of this group was that they thought it was possible to, for the United States to achieve something they called military AI readiness and intelligence community AI readiness by 2025. That's really about as good as Xi Jinping saying China is going to become a leading world power in artificial intelligence by 2030. So one wonders about, what's the sort of scientific basis or the policy sense in doing what they're doing. Now, really just on this slide, I've got some of the judgments out of the report on what China looks like in the future. And I really think the most important part about this set of judgments is not whether China is winning or losing. It's really the character and the nature of the Chinese regime and the invidious purposes to which they put artificial intelligence. So it doesn't matter who's winning or losing, because if the sorts of objectives that the Chinese government has in civil surveillance and in political system superiority, if they put that alongside AI, then it doesn't matter who's winning the AI race, because this is such a serious threat in and of itself. And if I was to commend this report and the National Security Commission on AI for anything, I think it's this deep appreciation of the relationship between the character of the Chinese regime and the use of artificial intelligence. And I say that fully informed of the sorts of invidious uses to which corporations and intelligence agencies in the West can also apply the same sort of technologies. Okay, I mentioned the 6 input areas of artificial intelligence, where some background work for this commission apparently had made an assessment that the United States was ahead in 3. The ones on the left, hardware, algorithms and talent, and that China might be doing much better than the United States in integration in data and applications. And at a personal level, without having done a lot of deep research, I really question whether or not China is ahead of the United States in anything to do with integration. But let's take their judgment and let's understand if we can't interrogate it a little bit further. I won't do it here, but it's just an interesting background set of judgments which I heard expressed by one of the principal members of the executive of this commission in a webinar that he gave. Quite interesting. Now, the main conclusion of this report, and one which I find highly questionable, is the proposition that America is not prepared to defend or compete in the AI area. Now, there's all sorts of ways we can say that that might be true, but in a sense, the statement's a little bit sort of, open to question as to what it really means. Prepared to defend what? That's a little bit unclear. Compete, we might understand a little bit more easily, but the overwhelming proposition where the report says, on the one hand, America is leading in AI, it's doing all of these wonderful things, but then the departure point of the report is that America is not prepared to defend or compete in the AI area, I think is notable. It will be interesting to understand the contradiction between those particular points of view. One of the really amazing things about this report, and why I like it especially, is that it comes up with 3 high priority sets of recommendations among hundreds. It's a brilliant report in terms of the detail, but it focuses its main efforts in the executive summary on leadership, talent and hardware. And I think they're really powerful recommendations and worthy of very close examination. And just to relate the talent proposition to what James was saying, there's no way that we can understand the damaging and destabilising impacts of artificial intelligence unless we get highly trained talent who understand the principles of instability and stability in international affairs, who understand nuclear escalation and nuclear risk. We have to have those people tied up with the hardware, with this quest for the holy grail of artificial intelligence. The Commission also noted this 110-mile problem where a major semiconductor plant in Taiwan has a pretty big impact on the US supply chain for advanced chips. It's a fairly obvious fix, but I think a little bit too focused on that particular problem. But definitely the US push on hardware, I think, is laudable, and the Commission did a really good job on this front. So just to recap, there are a couple of really wonderful findings in this report, which I think are indisputable and so important. And I really think that these need to be elevated to a higher level of consideration than almost everything else that we talk about when we commonly talk about AI competition between the United States and China. One is the report's recommendations that the United States should work on a bilateral agreement with Russia and China, independently, separately, to assert the principle of human control of nuclear weapons. The report doesn't go much further into the detail of that, asking the question, for example, of whether that sort of principle would include a ban on AI assessments being involved in processes that support human decision-making. But that's a very fundamental question of how do you achieve a ban, an agreement by China to assert and maintain human control of nuclear weapons at all times. Second point I mentioned is the one about the values competition. This is so massively important, and it's, in a sense, 10 degrees of importance more important than the question of who's winning the technological race in AI, broadly defined by some sort of elaborate methodology. This question of the ability of a country, whether it's the United States government or China, to take AI and use it for mass manipulation, mass disinformation, is fundamentally important and is of a very high level of seriousness. To change tack a little bit, there's a couple of interesting sort of blind spots, I think, in the report. I think that they didn't really reflect what you might call comprehensive knowledge of some things that US government and industry are capable of. I think that was more or less informed by a blanket proposition that the US is sort of doing some things well, but really is a bit limp and not doing so well. But I think there's things happening, for example, in the intelligence community in the use of artificial intelligence, which you get almost no sense of in this report. But equally, what stands out to me, reading about the importance of artificial intelligence in this report to economic development and things like smart cities, is that the report reflects almost nothing, almost no detail at all of the social situation in the United States and the way in which, what that interaction is. The report doesn't aim to do that. It's more about national security. But when you think about homeland security and the relationship between smart cities and urban decline and what role artificial intelligence can play in homeland security, I think that's definitely worthy of more attention. The report gets even better, really, in my view, when it says that completely against the grain of much of the US debate, that decoupling is not the answer to this. Decoupling is not the answer. The United States has to improve dialogue with China. It has to have a strategic dialogue at a high level and continuing. It's had them in the past, obviously in the view of this commission, not of the quality that we need. But interestingly, the report promotes a science and technology dialogue between the United States and China of a deep and meaningful kind, which we haven't seen for quite a while. And it promotes the idea of dialogue between the United States and China on WMD applications of artificial intelligence. And I've just called out two smaller points to finish with. And this is the proposition to bridge the talent gap. One of the recommendations of the Commission is that the United States should provide a path to citizenship for all graduating foreign students in the country. And this is a really interesting proposal because it's a sort of radical idea for a country not all that keen on immigration at the moment in many respects, But Obama had the idea in his presidency that there was a talent arms race going on between the United States and China. Xi Jinping thinks the same, and here's a rather radical proposal for the United States to, quote unquote, win the AI arms race by giving a path to citizenship. And on a final note, let me just say that the proposals included a strong alliance element and the proposition that the United States needed to build a favourable international technology order. I think that's really important. I won't dwell on it. I think it sort of stands for itself. It obviously has aspects of cooperative security, and it also has aspects of block building and excluding others from access to certain technologies. So all in all, a brilliant report, definitely worth a lot of attention. I guess the biggest question I have in my mind is how can the United States create incentives for China to engage in the sorts of restraining sorts of dialogues that the Commission has in mind. I won't go through the other points on the slide in any detail. They relate to things I've already said. But I think the final unanswered question that I think is worth dwelling on is the one about how do we engage China in such a dialogue, and how do we provide incentives to China to engage in such a dialogue on things like a total ban on the use of AI in WMD decision making. So thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Greg, for your excellent presentation and your really thought-provoking questions. We have some questions now. We have about 27 minutes left for